You've probably heard of Oliver Twist, the young lad who, after looking down at his watery gruel, says, "Please, sir, I want some more." But do you know the terrible lore behind this iconic quotation? In this video, we are looking at the 1834 Poor Law. We are going to learn why it was such an important destructive law, look at the dreadful workhouses it encouraged, and learn how they and the law contributed to a specific Victorian subgenre, the Condition of England novel. To understand the 1834 Poor Law, we need to go even further back in time, because this was far from the first English Poor Law. During the medieval period, various official laws or categories were established to deal with the problem of vagrancy, or begging, or, well, just being poor. And these poor people most often found aid, food or shelter through the church. But then along came serial marrier Henry VIII, who, ever suspicious of the Catholics and always in search of more money, carried out a mass closure of the monasteries with his Dissolutions of the Monasteries Act between 1535 and 1539. This left a huge gap in terms of poor relief. Fortunately, his daughter, Elizabeth I, addressed this problem as Queen in 1601 with her Poor Relief Act, which is really where the history of formal ideas of welfare begin. This law was designed to collect money through taxes in order to give relief, money, food, medical care, jobs, to those who needed it most. At this time, there were two main types of poor relief. The first was the workhouse, where people would work to earn food and shelter. The second was called outdoor relief, so called because it was given outside of the workhouse. In 1601, this second type, the outdoor relief, was more common. The important thing to remember about this 1601 law is that it was a local system. Money was collected through local taxation and given to local churches or other charitable missions who would then give it out to people in the immediate area. In England, these areas were, and still often are, called parishes. So we can see that from 1601, the churches once again give aid to the local rural poor. It was far from a perfect system, but it did help, and it continued this way for hundreds of years. However, as always, no laws, systems, or safeguards work in a vacuum, and eventually this dual system of workhouse and outdoor poor relief gave way to something new. And while there were many contributing factors, I'm going to single out four main things which led to the creation of the 1834 Poor Law. The first was the great rural to town population shift that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. Many people ended up moving from their native farms, now more and more technologically assisted, to seek work in towns and cities. However, removed from their home villages, poor people no longer had access to the local outdoor relief they might have more easily obtained at home, and so ended up sadly knocking at the town's workhouse door. The second is linked to the first, and was the fact that huge amounts of once public land, which could be farmed, were privatised and sold off to rich buyers. If you want to know more, have a look at the 1773 Enclosure Act. But the essential thing is that without this public land, people had no choice but to find work elsewhere, in cities and towns, often sadly ending up at the workhouse. The third was a huge population boom that occurred around the Industrial Revolution. It's estimated that between 1750 and 1850, England's population doubled, which is honestly staggering. And more people meant, sadly, more poor people. If you consider that outdoor relief was already often stretched, imagine doubling the amount who were in need. This increase obviously caused a huge strain on the churches and charities who were trying to administer the relief. The fourth was the 1832 Royal Commission on Poor Law Reform, but more specifically, it was the ideas of some of the men who oversaw it. Most well known, perhaps, is Edwin Chadwick, a man who was the poster child for a particular type of political philosophy that was in vogue at the time, and, by the way, is again today. Chadwick was a Benthamite, a philosophy named after Jeremy Bentham, who popularized the idea of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism seeks to analyze laws or decisions by ranking their ability to do the greatest good or happiness for the greatest amount of people, which might sound seductive if you're one of the ones who has the time, resources, and energy to even think about such a philosophy. But in reality, it's actually really dangerous. One big question is who decides actually what good or happiness are? After all, one of Bentham's great ideas was the panopticon, a huge watchtower in the middle of a workhouse designed to make sure that the poor workers felt so observed that they would be even more productive. So yeah, nice one. But at the time, this kind of thinking became really popular among the middle and upper classes. And remember, these were the voters in society, and hence these were the people who got to decide. These richer folk were not very pleased with the explosion in poverty, not necessarily because they cared about the conditions of the poor, but because they cared that their money was being used to fund poor relief. And poor relief, with population booms and changes in industrial practices, was becoming very, very expensive. For them, the country was suffering because the poor refused to work. For them, the poor couldn't be trusted to look after themselves. For them, the poor should be controlled centrally and stringently, which is exactly what ended up happening. But more on that later. For now, back to Edwin Chadwick. To give him some credit, Chadwick really did go out investigating. He was known for his thorough inspection of poor people's living and working conditions, and throughout his career he continued to try to improve people's lives in the way he thought best. Throughout his career, Chadwick focused on health and sanitation, arguing that the poor were sometimes unable to work because of poor sanitation. But, as mentioned, he was also a staunch follower of Bentham, and was intent on reforming the old 1601 Poor Law. The problem, as he saw it, was that the current system was too local, too chummy, fit only to encourage people not to work. For Chadwick and many others, the system needed to be controlled by central government, by bureaucrats, not priests, by people who could stop giving easy handouts and make people work. We see all this in the 1832 Royal Commission report, which argued that outdoor relief was to be banned so that able-bodied poor people had to enter the workhouse to get relief. Parishes ought to be grouped together so as to eradicate what many middle and upper classes assume to be local favouritism. And worst of all, the workhouse must be designed to be less appealing than all and any lowest paid real work, so as to discourage the poor from living on the backs of the middle and upper classes, which, in a usual rich person's hypocrisy, fails to acknowledge the devastating impact of the Enclosure Act I mentioned earlier. If you're getting a real sense of déjà vu right now, don't worry, I did too. Much of these arguments are likely familiar to you, because they've also been dominating our recent history. The poor are lazy, they need to work, it's all their own fault, and so on and so on. So there you are, my 4 top reasons for why the 1834 Poor Law had to be introduced. Overcrowded cities, boom in population, changes in industrial practices, boom in hypocritical rich people. A tale truly as old as time. Quite simply, the law sought to reduce the cost of poor relief by increasing the scope of the workhouses. Men, women and children who had been living, surviving, on outdoor relief suddenly found that these resources were very difficult to obtain and therefore had no choice but to enter the workhouse. And of the workhouses, the system was thoroughly centralised. Piecemeal workhouses and outdoor charitable relief systems that had existed for centuries were replaced with the boards of guardians who oversaw the deployment and operation of a mass network of workhouses. These guardians were often none other than rich businessmen who saw profit and opportunity on the backs of poor people. Before the Poor Law, there were almost 3,000 workhouses. This might sound like a lot, but they were often small and rural. Although the conditions in these small workhouses were often fairly terrible, they worked locally, meaning people didn't always have to separate from their families and could also seek additional outdoor relief through the church. But after the Poor Law, there were considerably fewer workhouses, but those that remained, or those that were newly built, were much bigger. And when I was researching this, I was struck by how much the development of the workhouse really did mirror the development of the Industrial Revolution. As farmers lost the right to grow on local land, and farming became a huge industrial process, so too did local small workhouses close to become huge industrial processes. People were placed in these larger workhouses to be more efficient. The workhouses, remember, were designed to be the lowest standard of living in the country, with the idea being that this would cause people to do anything, i.e. any form of work, to avoid joining one. It was a system of deterrence. The unofficial slogan might have been, "If you refuse to find work, we'll treat you like an animal." I think most people think first of food as a reason people joined the workhouses, which is correct. Food was often scarce for the Victorian poor, and a lack of bread did drive people into the workhouse. But I want to draw people's attention to the lengths people would go to avoid joining the workhouse, because I think these speak volumes about their deplorable conditions. With much of the budget for outdoor relief gone, the poor people who were sick often had nowhere else to go for medical aid than the workhouse. I found a report written in 1909 which looked specifically at the connection between illness and the workhouse. Of the 915,000 simultaneous paupers in England and Wales, probably 120,000 are acutely sick, requiring not merely maintenance, but also appropriate medical treatment. It's clear that a huge proportion of the poor were in desperate need for medical treatment, but in the instances that it was available through charities or relief, the poor were often afraid to seek it out because it was associated with the Poor Law and, by extension, the workhouse. In other words, despite quite literally dying, they would avoid seeking medical attention due to the fear of the workhouse. Conditions and stipulations were often purposely awful to try to force people to work, as the report continues. The fact that public medical aid is associated with the Poor Law is itself a deterrent, and in some unions, other deterrents are added by the way in which medical orders have to be obtained. Testimony given by a special medical investigator and those officially responsible for the public health makes it clear that a deterrent administration of Poor Law medical relief has a gravely adverse effect on the public health. In other words, because conditions in the workhouses were so bad, huge numbers of what otherwise would be able-bodied workers were becoming ill because they were avoiding seeking medical attention via the Poor Law and the workhouse, which means that the Poor Law was, counter to its intentions, making the workforce often more unfit for work. Well done, rich people. But that's not all. For those who finally did relent, regretfully knocking on at the workhouse in the hope of finding medical aid, often because there was literally no other doctor or hospital available, there was very often none to be found. The report continues. The small rural workhouses, of which there are about 300, with fewer than 50 sick beds in each, are, over nearly half the superficial area of England and Wales, the only institutions in the nature of a hospital available. But most of these are old and ill-adapted to meet modern requirements. But the worst defects centre around the medical attendance and nursing. In spite of all the efforts of the local government board, there are still many rural workhouses without even a trained nurse, and no nurse, trained or untrained, for night duty. Our medical investigator reported that in only 2 or 3 rural workhouses was the staff sufficient. I honestly just can't imagine how soul-destroying that must have been. To have tried to battle on, ill or in chronic pain, outside of the workhouse, only to have finally given in and joined, and then to find that there wasn't a single medical professional in the workhouse. It's just absolutely outrageous. While researching for this video, I looked into many different workhouses and found that one of the most shocking cases was the Huddersfield workhouse. This was especially shocking for me because Huddersfield is my hometown. Huddersfield is in West Yorkshire, in the north of England, and it's a Victorian town that was extremely busy and well known for its textiles. And it's quite close to Haworth, which some of you may know as the home of the Bronte sisters. But the Huddersfield workhouse had absolutely nothing of the rugged, traumatic landscapes the Brontes describe. The trauma here was political, hygienic, and laborious. Huddersfield was a politically radical town, and the ratepayers, taxpayers, in Huddersfield initially didn't want a new workhouse in the town. There had always been small, local work and poor houses in Huddersfield which were managed locally in conjunction with outdoor forms of relief, like the church. But the Poor Law removed this local authority when the Board of Guardians took control of the Huddersfield workhouse around 1839. This board wanted a larger workhouse to group more people, more efficiently, together. But the radicals in Huddersfield resisted this for as long as they could, with the new workhouses only being built 20 years later. However, the Huddersfield Township Workhouse became a national scandal in 1848 due to its appalling conditions. I want to remind you, the Board of Guardians took over the running of the workhouse in 1839, 9 years before this report was published, so they were in control. Here are its findings. The overseers are forced to the conclusion that the sick poor have been most shamefully neglected, that they have been and still are devoid of the necessary articles of clothing and bedding, that they have been suffered to remain for weeks at a time in the most filthy and disgusting state, that patients have been allowed to remain for 9 weeks together without a change of linen or of bedding clothing, that beds in which patients suffering in typhus have died, one after another, have been again and again repeatedly used for fresh patients without any change or attempt at purification, that the said beds were only bags of straw and shavings, for the most part laid on the floor, and that the whole swarmed with lice, that 2 patients suffering an infectious fever were almost constantly put together in one bed, that it not infrequently happened that one would be ragingly delirious when the other was dying, and that it is a fact that a living patient has occupied the same bed with a corpse for a considerable period after death. Of the general treatment of the poor in the workhouse, the overseers have to report that the house is, and has been for a considerable period, crowded out with inmates, that there are 40 children occupying one room 8 yards by 5, that these children sleep 4, 5, 6, 7 and even 10 in one bed, that 30 females live in another room of similar size, and that 50 adult males have to cram into one room 7.5 yards long by 6 yards wide, that the diet of the establishment has been and still is insufficient, that 4 shillings worth of shin of beef or leg offal with 42 pounds of potatoes have been made to serve for soup for 150 inmates. Please sir, I want some more. And frankly, it's absolutely no wonder why the Victorian writers picked up their pens to discuss this horrendous situation. Victorian literature is dominated by realist novels that engage directly with the conditions and politics of the time. And, well, this is because an awful lot of things changed in the Victorian period. As means of a quick illustration, here is a very non-exhaustive list of some of the key events around Victoria's reign. She took the throne in 1837. The 1833 Act for the Abolition of Slavery throughout the British colonies. The 1834 Poor Law, the subject of today's video, the 1839 to 42 Opium Wars against China, the 1845 Factory Act, which stopped children aged between 8 and 13 from working more than 6.5 hours a day, the 1845 Great Potato Famine in Ireland. Throughout the 1840s generally, there was a huge boom in railways in Britain, the 1854 to 56 Crimean War. In 1858, Britain takes control of India. In 1868, the end of public hanging was seen in Britain. The 1880s saw the introduction of electric lighting. In 1891, free education was available for children up to age 13. Some of the most famous writers who took up their pens to address some of these social and political questions were Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Benjamin Disraeli, who was also Prime Minister, Charlotte Bronte, and Elizabeth Gaskell. And as you can see, with wars, child labour, slavery, the empire, there was much more than just the poor law driving the condition of England novels. But as I hope you realise from the description of Huddersfield Workhouse, the effects of the poor law were so abhorrent that it became one of the most important questions of the time. There are many Victorian novels that deal with the problem of the workhouse. If you want a literary classic, go and read Charles Dickens or Elizabeth Gaskell. Many of their works revolve directly or indirectly around the poor law. I, however, decided to look at a slightly lesser known novel. Now, I wouldn't say it has the same literary brilliance as its more famous contemporaries, but it does directly focus on the poor law. It's called Yeast, a Problem, and was written by Charles Kingsley in 1848. Kingsley really did have some ideas that were both revolutionary and ahead of their time. He was appalled by the disparity between rich and poor, campaigned for better sanitation, and disliked hypocrisy in religion. But he also became a Christian minister with some questionable ideas about Northern mythology and, as was unfortunately typical of the time, held staunchly anti-Irish views. A complicated person who was neither total saint nor total sinner. Yeast is a social and philosophical story that looks at the tensions between religion, science, and the newly industrialized world. The title Yeast is supposed to represent the fermenting of revolutionary ideas aimed at toppling the status quo. And we can see that in Kingsley's descriptions of the workhouse. In one scene, a rich old squire shouts at a younger man called Tregarva. "Here, you sir, you, look at this. Is that the way you repay me? I, who have kept you out the workhouse, treated you like my own, and then you go and write filthy, rascally, radical ballads on me and mine. This comes of your Methodism, you canting, sneaking hypocrite, you viper, you adder, you snake, you." I think I'm going to start saying you canting, sneaking hypocrite at more people. Tregarva is a social reformer who campaigns against the treatment of the poor, and we can see here how much of a threat the workhouse truly is. The first thing the squire says is, "I who have kept you out the workhouse," almost as if it were the worst of all eventualities, which, as we learned earlier, truly was the case and ambition. Later in the novel, the narrator describes this scene. As he went on, talking wildly to himself, he passed the Union Workhouse. Opposite the gate, under the lee of a wall, some 20 men, women and children were huddled together on the bare ground. They had been refused lodging in the workhouse and were going to pass the night in that situation. As he came up to them, coarse jests and snatches of low drinking songs, ghastly as the laughter of lost spirits in the pit, mingled with the feeble wailings of some child of shame. And finally, Kingsley describes the situation faced by the working man more generally. "No wonder indeed, sir. They've no time to think. They're born to be machines, and machines they must be. And I think, sir," he added bitterly, "it's God's mercy that they daren't think. It's God's mercy they don't feel. Men that write books and talk at elections call this a free country, and they say that the poorest and the meanest has a free opening to rise and become Prime Minister, if he can. But you see, sir, the misfortune is that in practice he can't. For one who gets into a gentleman's family, or into a little shop, and so saves a few pounds, 50 know that they've no chance before them. But day labourer born, day labourer live, from hand to mouth, scraping and pinching to get not meat and butter even, but bread and potatoes. And then, at the end of it all, For a worthy reward, £0.50 a week of parish pay, or the workhouse. That's a lively, hopeful prospect for a Christian man. I hope this video has helped begin to explain why this subgenre emerged, why the law had such an impact on the literature of the 19th century, and why we often come across this threat or reference to the workhouse while reading Victorian literature. The workhouses closed officially in the 1930s, and the welfare state eventually came to replace it. But we need to be vigilant. Only 6 years ago, the impact of successive Conservative UK governments was likened to the Victorian workhouses. And, perhaps more worryingly covert, I found an article written by journalist Daniel Lavelle in 2017 about his time at a so-called charity which he likened more to a Victorian workhouse. I'll link it in the description. I think it's worth a read. The Victorian workhouses and the Victorian condition of England question might thankfully seem like relics of the past, but I am certain that in years to come, a new bunch of books and films from the last 10 or 15 years will be canonised and picked over as a condition of the UK subgenre. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe to keep up to date with all my latest videos all about the law and literature.